In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the precarious future of Western civilization hung by a thread that was fraying with every passing hour. While the Battle of Britain had been miraculously won in the skies, the Blitz was raging furiously in the streets, leaving London burning and Coventry devastated. On the maps of the world, the British Empire still appeared vast and invincible, a splash of imperial pink covering nearly a quarter of the globe. However, inside the claustrophobic war rooms of Whitehall, the men who ran the government guarded a terrifying secret that they dared not whisper to the public. The empire was not merely bleeding soldiers on the battlefield, it was bleeding to death financially, hemorrhaging wealth at a rate that signaled imminent collapse. Winston Churchill, the man whose voice was rallying the free world, sat at his desk in the underground cabinet war rooms to write a critical letter. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and contained a message that would change the course of history forever. Churchill was a master of the English language, a man who could turn a phrase into a weapon, but this letter required a humiliating dance. He had to confess to the leader of the richest neutral nation that Great Britain, the workshop of the world, was completely and utterly broke. The letter was long and detailed, describing the strategic situation, the U-boat peril in the Atlantic, and the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the sting was in the tail, as Churchill wrote that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury could no longer pay for supplies. He admitted that while the British people would fight on the beaches, they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached this point of destitution, we must examine the ruthless and unforgiving economics of total war. When the conflict began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial titan holding billions of dollars in gold reserves and overseas investments. British citizens owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and vast industrial concerns in the United States, making London the hub of global finance. However, the war that Hitler launched was different from any that had come before. It was a war of machines that consumed immense resources. It devoured steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at a rate that defied all pre-war calculations, draining the national stockpiles with terrifying speed and efficiency. Crucially, the blockade of the European continent meant that Britain could no longer trade with its neighbors and had to look across the Atlantic. At this early stage in the war, the United States was officially neutral, and the American public remained staunchly isolationist and wary of foreign entanglements. They remembered the First World War when American boys had died in European mud, and they were determined not to get dragged into another slaughter. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, legislative barriers specifically designed to keep America safely insulated from the fires of foreign war. These acts contained a specific hard-nosed clause known as cash and carry, a policy that dictated the terms of survival. The law stated that belligerent nations like Britain could purchase American supplies, but the terms were strictly non-negotiable and immediate. They had to pay for every bullet and bandage in cash, up front, and transport the goods across the ocean on their own ships. There would be no loans, no credit lines, and no financial mercy. The Americans were running a business, not a charity. The Americans were happy to sell the weapons of war, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before crates left New York. For the first year of the war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these relentless demands, liquidating centuries of accumulated wealth. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the British government undertook the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. They loaded the entire gold wealth of the nation onto battleships and fast liners, preparing to ship it into exile. These ships navigated the dangerous U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic to deposit the bullion in secure vaults in Canada. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities were sent away to satisfy the American bill collectors waiting on the other side. By late 1940, the vaults were empty, the gold was gone, and the liquid cash reserves had completely evaporated. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington, responsible for buying planes, sat paralyzed with contracts on their desks they could not sign. Treasury officials in London had delivered the crushing news. There were simply no dollars left to honor any further agreements. When Roosevelt received Churchill's desperate letter, he understood the stakes immediately. He knew the geopolitical dominoes were lined up. He knew that if Britain fell, the United States would be the next target in a world dominated by hostile powers. But he also faced a massive political problem. He could not simply hand over money to a foreign power. American laws strictly forbade it, and the American public would be outraged at the thought of funding another European conflict. He needed a way to help Britain that looked like a hard-headed business deal, not a soft-hearted charity handout. He needed to sell the war effort to the skeptical American taxpayer using language they could understand and accept. This is where the concept of Lend-Lease was born, a legislative masterpiece designed to bypass the financial blockade of the Neutrality Acts. Roosevelt explained it to the press with a folksy, disarming analogy that would become famous throughout the American political landscape. He argued that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle with him over the price of a garden hose. You simply lend him the hose to put out the fire, and he returns it to you when the danger has passed. It sounded simple, generous, and moral, painting the act of assistance as a neighborly duty rather than a financial transaction. But the reality of the negotiations taking place behind closed doors in Washington was entirely different from this public fairy tale. It was not a conversation between friendly neighbors. It was a ruthless foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. The man in charge of the American Treasury was Henry Morgenthau Jr., a complex figure who held the keys to survival. He was a staunch anti-fascist who wanted to defeat Hitler, but he was also the jealous guardian of the American taxpayer. He believed that before the United States gave a single dime of aid, Britain must prove it was financially destitute. He wanted to ensure the British weren't hiding money, so Morgenthau demanded a full and humiliating audit of the British Empire. He demanded a list of every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens globally. He wanted to know the value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, and every share of stock in British possession. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned by the audacity of being asked to open their books. They were being treated not as a valiant ally fighting a common enemy, but as a failed company entering into receivership. Phillips tried to argue that Britain had already sold off its gold and that further liquidation would be a disaster. He explained that selling long-term investments in the middle of a war would be a fire sale yielding pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the country unable to feed its population after the war ended. Morgenthau remained unmoved, as his instructions from the president were clear: no aid until the barrel was scraped clean. The logic was brutal. Why should a farmer in Iowa pay for a tank if a British lord still owned a factory? The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the tragic case of the American Viscose Corporation, a massive industrial giant. As the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States, it dominated the market with immense production capabilities. It was owned by the British company Courtaulds and was considered a glittering jewel in the crown of British overseas investment. Highly profitable, it generated millions of dollars a year in dividends that flowed back to London to balance the trade deficit. Henry Morgenthau identified American Viscose as a prime target and told the British negotiators that they had to sell it immediately. He demanded that the cash from the sale be deposited directly into the US Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted fiercely, knowing the company was worth over $100 million and was a vital economic asset. To sell such a massive entity in a rush during wartime would be nothing short of financial suicide for the owners. But Morgenthau held all the leverage, as the critical Lend-Lease bill was currently making its precarious way through a skeptical Congress. Isolationist politicians were attacking the bill, arguing that Britain was actually rich and trying to trick America into paying its bill. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to prove to Congress that Britain was bleeding and had truly exhausted its own resources. He gave the British an ultimatum: sell American viscose immediately, or the Lend-Lease bill would die on the committee floor. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under immense pressure from Washington, the British government seized the corporation from its owners. They did not ask for permission. It was a compulsory purchase order issued under emergency war powers to appease the American. The sale was handled by a group of American investment bankers who knew the British were desperate and cornered. Because everyone knew it was a distressed sale, the bankers drove a merciless bargain that bordered on financial predation. The company was sold for roughly $54 million, a fraction of its true value, in a deal that stunned observers. It was effectively a theft, as the company was worth at least double that amount in any fair market valuation. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back in London, adding significantly to their own internal national debt. While the dollars from the sale went straight into the US Treasury, the sale marked a bitter turning point in the relationship. The forced sale of American Viscose was the precise moment the British elite realized the true, bitter price of the special relationship. They understood they were not equal partners, but a junior entity being systematically stripped of assets to pay for their own survival. The United States was effectively absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not by military conquest, but by legal contract. But this liquidation wasn't limited to industrial assets. It extended deep into the geopolitical foundations of the empire itself. While financial negotiators argued over stock prices, another desperate deal was being cut involving the battered Royal Navy. Britain was screaming for destroyers because German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could possibly replace them. The vital lifeline to North America was being severed, threatening to starve the island nation into a humiliating surrender. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, World War I-era ships that were currently sitting in mothballs. These vessels were obsolete, rusting in American naval yards and considered of little combat value to the modern US Navy. Roosevelt agreed to provide them to Britain, but once again, there was a steep price attached to the assistance. He did not give them for free. He traded them in a transaction that would reshape the global map. In exchange for 50 rusting ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a string of British naval bases. The list included strategic locations from Newfoundland in Canada to the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Think about the sheer scale of that trade. Britain gave the United States a strategic footprint covering the entire Western Hemisphere. They effectively handed over the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, securing American dominance for generations. This deal allowed the United States to build military bases on British sovereign territory, expanding its reach without firing a shot. These bases would project American power for a century, all purchased for 50 old ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale, a desperate liquidation of imperial real estate to keep the lights on in London. Britain was trading its long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival, sacrificing the future to survive the present. It was the act of a desperate nation hawking the family silver to buy food, hoping to live another day. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been effectively stripped clean. The gold reserves had vanished, the strategic US investments were being sold off, and key naval bases were leased away. The British Treasury echoed with emptiness, a hollow shell of the financial powerhouse that had once dominated the globe. The Lend-Lease Act was hailed in public as the arsenal of democracy, a slogan that inspired hope and solidarity. It was presented to the world as a noble act of alliance against tyranny, and in many practical ways, it was. It provided the tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept the British heart beating when it should have stopped. Without this massive infusion of supplies, the Nazi war machine would likely have starved the British Isles into submission. But the financial terms buried in the fine print laid the groundwork for a post-war world order dominated by America. The aid was explicitly not a gift, it was a lease, implying ownership remained with the lender, not the user. The underlying assumption was that there would be a reckoning, a final accounting where the bill would eventually come due. The text of the Lend-Lease Agreement contained a specific clause known as Article 7, hidden in dense diplomatic language. It was a small paragraph that most would overlook, but it contained a lethal poison pill for the British Empire. It stated that in return for the aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its Imperial Preference system after the war. Imperial Preference was the economic wall that held the disparate parts of the British Empire together as a single unit. It was a system of tariffs that favoured trade between Britain and its colonies like Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa. It meant that British goods were cheaper in empire markets than American goods, protecting British industry from foreign competition. It was the vital mechanism that allowed British industry to survive against the more efficient and powerful American manufacturing machine. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own economic defences and expose its soft underbelly. They were agreeing to open up their exclusive empire markets to aggressive American exporters who were eager to expand. They were effectively signing the death warrant of their own trading bloc, ending the economic logic of the empire. The British negotiators fought tooth and nail against Article 7, knowing it spelled the end of the empire as an economic unit. But with German bombers overhead and U-boats strangling the Atlantic, they had absolutely no leverage to refuse the American demand. They signed the agreement, effectively mortgaging their future independence to secure the weapons needed to survive the present nightmare. As 1941 turned into 1942, the global dynamic shifted violently again with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States officially entered the war, and suddenly Britain and America were fighting side by side against the Axis powers. American soldiers poured into Britain, transforming the island into an immense, unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. Army Air Force. But while they were military brothers in arms, the financial disparity between the two nations only grew wider and more grotesque. American industry, fueled by massive government spending and untouched by enemy bombs, exploded in size, efficiency, and technological capability. The U.S. economy grew by huge percentages every single year, becoming the undisputed engine of global production and wealth creation. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being distorted, cannibalized, and hollowed out by the relentless demands of the total war effort. To survive, Britain stopped exporting commercial goods, converting every single factory and workshop to the production of war material. They abandoned their lucrative markets in Latin America and Asia, leaving a commercial vacuum that demanded to be filled. And who stepped into those abandoned markets to satisfy the demand for goods? It was the aggressive American corporations. While British factories were obsessively churning out Spitfires and ammunition, American factories were managing a dual feat of production. They were making Spitfires for the war, but also refrigerators, radios, and cars for the hungry global consumer market. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future and capturing its loyal customer base. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was absolute, a complete reversal of the financial order of the 19th century. The gold reserves of the world had physically moved from the vaults of London to the fortified depths of Fort Knox. The financial centre of gravity had permanently shifted across the Atlantic, leaving London as a satellite orbiting Washington's sun. Yet, the British still believed that their immense sacrifice would be honoured, a hope that would soon be cruelly dashed. They naively believed that Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period, a soft landing to ease the shift back to peace. They were catastrophically wrong. Having forgotten the harsh lesson of the American Viscose sale, sentiment has no place in finance. They had forgotten that in the cold, calculated world of high finance and geopolitics, gratitude is simply not a valid currency. The moment the war ended, the bill would come due, and the shock of that realization would break British power. The story of the price of victory is the paradox of how a nation can win a war militarily but lose it economically. Britain had defeated Germany, but in the process, it had effectively defeated itself by destroying its own financial foundations. It had spent its glorious past to secure its precarious present, and in doing so, it had sold its future to its ally. On August 15th, 1945, the news flashed around the world. Japan had surrendered, and World War II was finally over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting for the king, lighting bonfires, and hugging strangers in pure relief. It was a moment of unadulterated joy, as the tyranny of the Axis powers had been crushed by the resilience of the free world. The British Empire had stood alone against the darkness in the grim early years, and against all odds, it had prevailed. But across the Atlantic Ocean in Washington, D.C., there was no such sentimentality, only a cold, bureaucratic machine switching gears. 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that would devastate the British economy. He signed the executive order to terminate Lend-Lease, a move that would cause more damage than any German bomb. The cutoff was brutal, immediate, and absolute, with no transition period and no grace period for the exhausted ally. The order stated that as of that specific moment, all aid stopped, severing the lifeline that kept Britain fed and functioning. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, American Liberty ships loaded with wheat and meat were ordered to turn around. Ships bound for Liverpool with vital supplies simply reversed course and sailed back to the United States, leaving Britain stranded. The British government was paralyzed by shock, having assumed that the aid would continue to help them rebuild their shattered country. They had assumed that their economy, which had been completely distorted to fight a common war, would be given time to adjust. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and government advisor, looked at the national ledger and stared directly into the abyss. He saw that Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials using borrowed American dollars. Without those dollars flowing in, the country was effectively bankrupt, not in a year or a month, but instantly. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk, a catastrophe that required a desperate and humiliating retreat to survive. The country would have to default on its international payments and immediately stop importing vital food supplies. The rations, which had been meager during the war, would have to be cut to starvation levels for everyone. Factories would have no raw materials to work with, leading to mass unemployment and potential social collapse in the streets. There was only one option left for the proud empire. Britain had to go to Washington and beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for the United States on a final mission. He was sick, exhausted, and suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. But he went anyway. He was the greatest economic mind of the century. But he was arriving not as an intellectual giant, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a powerful moral case to present to the American Treasury and the American people. He planned to argue that Britain had fought the war alone for 2 years while America remained profitable and neutral. He would argue that Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to hold the line and save Western civilization from tyranny. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a gift, a grant of $6 billion, not a commercial loan. He viewed this not as charity, but as a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had already spent. He called it justice, a balancing of the books between two allies who had shared the burden of victory. But when he finally arrived in Washington, he found that justice was not a currency the Americans recognized or valued. The mood had changed completely. The war was over, the ticker tape had been swept away, and the party was finished. The American public was tired of paying for Europe's problems and wanted to focus on their own booming prosperity. Politicians in Congress viewed the new Labour government in Britain with deep suspicion, seeing it as a dangerous slide towards socialism. Having just been elected on a platform of nationalizing industries, the British government represented everything American capitalism opposed. Congress had absolutely no intention of using American tax dollars to subsidize what they viewed as a radical socialist experiment. The American negotiators were led by Fred Vinson, a hard-faced man who looked at the frail Keynes with cold, unblinking eyes. They delivered the verdict bluntly. There would be no gift, no grant, and no retroactive payment for wartime sacrifices. There would only be a loan, calculated on strict commercial terms, with interest, treated like any other business transaction. Keynes was devastated, arguing that charging interest to an ally who had bankrupted itself, fighting a common enemy, was morally bankrupt. He warned them that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the rising threat of the Soviet Union. But the Americans held every single card in the deck, and they knew Britain had absolutely nowhere else to go. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion, a sum that was barely enough to keep the country functioning. Worse than the insufficient amount, the loan came with strings attached that were designed to strangle Britain's economic independence. The most poisonous condition was a clause demanding sterling convertibility within 1 year of receiving the funds. This technical term meant that anyone in the world holding British pounds could exchange them freely for US dollars. The Americans framed this demand as a noble push for free trade and the opening of global markets. In reality, it was a calculated weapon designed to break the sterling area, the financial wall protecting the British Empire. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds that could not be exchanged. This created a closed loop, where countries like India, Australia, and Egypt were forced to buy British goods with their trapped money. It was a protectionist mechanism that ensured British industry had a captive market, shielding it from superior American competition. The Americans wanted to smash that loop, knowing that if the pound became convertible, the protective wall would crumble instantly. They knew that given the choice, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy stronger, more valuable US dollars. American cars were sleeker, American fridges were colder, and American machines were simply better than their war-weary British counterparts. Keynes knew with mathematical certainty that this condition was a death trap, a mechanism designed to drain the loan in weeks. He fought against the clause until his health finally broke, arguing that the British economy was too fragile to withstand the shock. But the alternative to accepting the American terms was immediate starvation and the total collapse of the British industrial base. Reluctantly and bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan, knowing they were signing away their economic sovereignty. Many MPs described the agreement as a financial Munich, an act of appeasement to a new superpower just to survive the winter. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946, sealing the fate of the sterling area and the empire's independence. John Maynard Keynes died just a few months later, his heart finally giving out under the immense stress of the negotiations. He died trying to save his country from the financial grip of its closest ally. But the tragedy was only just beginning. The winter of 1947 proved to be the coldest in living memory, burying the battered country in feet of snow. Coal stockpiles froze solid on the ground. Power stations shut down, and factories across the nation fell silent. People shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because there was no electricity, wondering if this was the victory they had fought for. It was in this frozen, dark atmosphere that the grim reality of the post-war world finally came home to the British people. They had won the war militarily, but their standard of living was plummeting faster than it had during the conflict itself. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was suddenly rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had truly begun, a grey period of shortages and decline that would define a generation. And then, with the country on its knees, the clock struck the deadline for the American condition, July 15, 1947. Per the strict terms of the loan, Britain opened the window and made the pound sterling fully convertible to US dollars. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted on his deathbed. It was an immediate and total financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds, desperate to get their hands on precious, stable US dollars. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it in a panic to get their hands on US currency. The money from the American loan, which was supposed to last for years, began to evaporate in a matter of days. In just one single month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars, watching its lifeblood drain away into the Atlantic. The financial hemorrhage was so violent that the government watched in horror as their reserves vanished before their eyes. They were bleeding to death financially, and the American condition was the knife that had opened the artery. After just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. They slammed the window shut, admitting total failure to the world and humiliating themselves before the US Treasury. They had burned through a huge portion of the loan for absolutely nothing, gaining no economic stability in return. The humiliation was total. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules and had been completely crushed. This moment of financial weakness had immediate and permanent geopolitical consequences that reshaped the Cold War. This was the specific moment the baton of world power was officially dropped by London and picked up by Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the US State Department that changed everything. It was a message of resignation, a formal admission that the empire could no longer afford its global obligations. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping Russian influence out of the Mediterranean. But now, with the treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford to pay the soldiers or subsidize the Greek government. The telegram essentially said, "We are broke. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you must do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine, where the United States stepped in to fill the vacuum Britain left behind. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It had been reduced to a regional power struggling simply to keep the lights on and its people fed. The economic misery dragged on, and in 1949, the government was forced to devalue the pound sterling. Before the war, the pound had been worth $4.86, a rock-solid symbol of imperial stability. In 1949, it was slashed brutally to just $2.80 in a single, devastating stroke. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Their purchasing power vanished. Imports became significantly more expensive, driving up the cost of living for families who were already struggling to survive. It was a painful public recognition that the British economy was no longer competitive on the modern global stage. But the final bill for the war wasn't just paid in the chaotic crises of the 1940s. It was a mortgage that spanned generations, a heavy financial shadow that hung over the nation for decades. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946, borrowed to keep Britain from starving, was explicitly not a gift. It was a strict commercial debt with interest that demanded regular, unrelenting service regardless of the economic climate. Every single year for 6 long decades, the British Treasury wrote a massive check to the United States Treasury. Through the post-war economic boom of the 1950s, the payments continued quietly and relentlessly in the background. Through the industrial gloom, power cuts, and strikes of the 1970s, the checks were still sent on time. During the Thatcher years of privatization and the Blair years of modernization, the debt remained a constant burden. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, finally closing the book on the war. Think about the staggering scale of that timeline and what it truly means for the history of the 20th century. 60 years after the guns fell silent in Europe, the financial bill for the conflict was finally settled. 60 years after the victory parades faded into memory, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of survival. The story of the price of victory is the ultimate debunking of the romantic idea that wars have winners. In the modern era of total war, conflict is a negative-sum game where everyone loses something vital. Germany lost the war and was destroyed physically, but Britain won the war and was effectively destroyed economically. The only true and unequivocal winner of the Second World War was the United States of America. The US economy had doubled in size during the conflict, fueled by the insatiable demand of the war machine. Its industrial heartland remained pristine and untouched by bombs, while its competitors lay in smoking ruin. By the end of the war, the United States held 2/3 of the entire world's gold reserves in its vault. Through the clever mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it had successfully dismantled the British Empire's trading preferences. It had systematically opened up global markets for American goods, ensuring a century of economic dominance. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies or fleets. It bought it. It acquired the strategic assets, the naval bases, and the geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale. This transfer of power was managed not by generals on a battlefield, but by lawyers and accountants in the US Treasury. For the British people, the legacy of 1941 remained a deep, lingering scar on the national psyche. It created a persistent sense of decline, a feeling that the country's best days were permanently in the past. It fueled the special relationship, which was always a polite diplomatic euphemism for one-sided dependency. When Winston Churchill wrote that desperate letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he undoubtedly saved his country from Hitler. But in the same stroke of the pen, he also signed the deed of sale for the empire he loved. He traded the long-term existence of the empire for the short-term survival of the island nation. It was a deal that absolutely had to be made. There was simply no other choice in the face of Nazi tyranny. But the cost was the future, a price that would be paid by generations of Britons yet unborn. Britain emerged from the war standing tall as a moral giant, a beacon of courage and resilience to the world. But simultaneously, it emerged as an economic pygmy, hollowed out and dependent on the charity of others. It had spent its entire inheritance to buy freedom for Europe, a sacrifice of unimaginable scale. It was a noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in recorded history, giving up imperial power to save the world from darkness. But in the cold, hard, unforgiving light of economics, it was nothing less than a total, systematic liquidation. The British Empire did not fall in battle. It was not conquered by foreign armies or destroyed by enemy fleets. It was sold off piece by piece, asset by asset, to pay the staggering bill for doing the right thing. Britain chose to be poor and free rather than rich and enslaved, paying the ultimate price for human liberty. This is the hidden history of World War II, the financial war that ran parallel to the military conflict. It serves as a stark warning that in the game of nations, debt is often as deadly as any weapon. The transition of global power from London to Washington was not an accident of history, but a calculated transaction. It reminds us that true victory often comes with a hidden price tag that takes generations to fully pay off. Understanding this financial history explains the world we live in today and the true nature of the alliances we rely on. I'm John, and this has been another deep dive into the hidden currents of the past on Cinematic History Tales. If you want to understand the forces that truly shape our world beyond the simple headlines, you need to join us. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve and uncover the complex stories that standard textbooks often leave out. Because when the history books are finally written, the truth is often found in the ledgers, not the speeches. You will want to be among the few who saw the true patterns of history before they inevitably repeated themselves. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for daring to question the established narratives of our collective past. We will see you in the next episode, where we will continue to explore the hidden price of power. Until then, remember that history is not just about what happened, but about who paid for it. The screen fades to black, leaving only the lingering echo of the cost of victory. End of episode.